All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session, Navigating the New Landscape of GLBA Compliance, Key Changes to Protect Your Federal Financial Aid. I'm Adam Scarzafava, AVP for Edge Events and Digital Marketing here at Edge, and I'm going to share just a little bit of information about Edge as an organization up front. For those of you who may not be as familiar with us and what we do before we get into the meat of today's session. So Edge is a nonprofit, member-based research and education network and a technology consortium. We are of, by, and for the higher education community first and foremost. We were formed by the President's Council for Higher Education out of New Jersey. We are still technically owned by those higher education presidents. So that is really at the core of everything that we do, is to serve the higher education community and help the higher ed community be more effective through the use of technology, knowing that that means so many more things nowadays than it has in the past. And our mission, our service area have really expanded as technology has expanded its impact in higher ed. We have also expanded regionally and nationwide. We have members in 17, it may actually be 18 or 19 states now and counting through the services that Edge provides, as well as our procurement cooperative, which I'll talk just a little bit more about in a second. Again, primarily higher ed and research, but we have grown to support the K-12, government communities, libraries, healthcare, particularly those healthcare organizations that are aligned with higher ed institutions and other nonprofits as well. We've actually helped higher ed institutions launch nonprofit institutes and groups out of their own institutions as well. So Edge was built initially to build a network around the state of New Jersey, because we still own and operate that network, and it has expanded regionally. We now have institutions connected in Pennsylvania and New York as well. So that sort of core competency of Edge continues to grow and continues to provide a great service to institutions throughout the region. Edge Discovery really supports doing research effectively through the use of technology, as well as helping to apply for and manage grants. Edge Market is that strategic and informed consortium procurement arm of what we do. We issue RFPs on behalf of the higher education and public sector community nationwide that institutions can use to streamline procurement and speed the time to innovation. That's where we have lots of institutions joining from states all across the country to participate in the procurement agreements and contracts that we make available. We host events, networking, and community building opportunities like what we're doing here today. We host 3 conferences throughout the year, and we hope that you'll have an opportunity to come join us in person at some point. And we do lots of thought leadership and solution development. We provide professional services and strategic leadership ourselves as a nonprofit at nonprofit rates in areas supporting digital transformation, cybersecurity, privacy, and compliance, which is the focus of today's webinar, but also cloud strategy and online and digital teaching and learning, which is really a growing area as institutions are realizing how important the online aspect can be to enrollment and to the health of the bottom line of the institution. So if you have any questions about anything else that Edge does, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here to support. Like I said, the core of the mission is supporting and helping higher ed institutions solve the challenges that they face. So please don't hesitate to reach out. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll get out of the way and invite Edge's lead virtual chief information security officer, Dr. Dawn Dunkerley, to take the wheel.
Thank you very much. All right, let me get this party started. Adam, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great. And one last reminder, everybody, please use the chat and Q&A. Ask any questions that you have for Dawn and Bobby as we go, and I'll make sure we get them answered.
Yep,
Thanks.
absolutely. I can't see you because I'm full screen myself, so I'll let Adam be in charge of telling me to pause. So thanks for that. So for those of you who I don't know, welcome. Glad to virtually meet you. My name is Dawn Dunkerley. As Adam said, I am the lead chief information, or virtual chief information security officer, VCISO. with EDGE. I am fortunate enough to have today another one of our VCSOs, Bobby Rogers. A little bit of my background, and then I'll let Bobby tell his as well, because it is relevant to this particular issue that we're going to discuss today. So before I began working with EDGE, I spent about 20 years with the federal government in a contractor and then in a civilian role, primarily supporting the Department of Defense. So a lot of what and Bobby and I have done this for years. A lot of what that entails is compliance with different regulations. So we're going to talk specifically today about some changes to one that is definitely going to impact higher education through the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Bobby, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Bobby Rogers, and looking at the list of participants, I know a few folks out there that I work with fairly often. My background is military, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, but I've done security for hospitals, banks, schools, and higher ed for probably about, I don't know, 10 years now across the country. As far as what we're talking about today, my background really is as an auditor for the most part. So I've been a government auditor before. I know what auditors look for. I know kind of what mentality and attitude you should take toward getting audited from a GLBA perspective as well as the NIST perspective. Been working with NIST for years and years and years and years and years. So I'm not an expert on it, but I can help answer questions and help guide you along your path to become compliant with NIST and integrate that into your security management program.
Thank you very much. All right, let's march along. So a little bit of a reminder, maybe there are people who are in the audience who are not as familiar with Gramm-Leach-Bliley and how that's affecting us from a technology perspective. But GLBA has been around for a long time, I believe 99 actually, but only I would say in the last 10 years or so has it become increasingly integrated with higher education and higher ed tech. If anybody in the audience was responsible or involved with the safeguards that went into place last year, so the 9 safeguards that went into place, and these were definitely more high level things such as conducting a formal risk assessment, enhanced training and personnel requirements, increased oversight of service providers, annual penetration testing in most cases, things like that, then you know that a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of effort went into making sure that even for those 9 things that we were, additionally required to do, that we were able to get those processes and policies and procedures into place. We're required to do that now because, as most of you probably know, GLBA is now a requirement. We have to attest that we are compliant with these safeguards in order to process our financial aid. So that student aid internet gateway system, somebody at the institution is attesting, whether it's a president or the CIO or someone is attesting that we are in compliance with these things when we make that move to be able to process our annual financial aid. Since 2018, FSA up at the Department of Education level has encouraged higher education to begin reviewing and working towards adoption of NIST SPS 800-171. So that's an encouragement since 2018. And in 2020, they actually put out a memo that they were going to begin the process of reviewing future compliance as a potential activity. There are no indications that won't be coming in the future. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that entails, but most importantly, the newest revision, as you see there, was updated in this May. So if you're in the process of already having adopted or working towards adoption of revision 2, things will have changed, and we're going to talk about what does that mean. So to that point, revision 3 will impact both new and existing customers. So a lot of the work that we do, Bobby and I both are virtual CISOs. If you work with us, you are already aware of GLBA requirements. In fact, my clients are probably sick to death of me talking about it. It's something we talk about most every week, and have been working for months to understand what are the things we already have in place, where are the gaps, and where do we need to go. So they on the Zoom meeting know that when revision 3, and it was no surprise, it had been in draft for quite some time, but when revision 3 came out and was actually made final, we're like, oh well, we have a lot of work to do. So what does that look like? And it's you see there an update or a revisit of completed assessments. So at some level, we will have done an internal assessment to understand, again, where are we good? Where do we have the policies and procedures and artifacts that we need to support? Now that has to be reviewed because things have changed, and we'll talk about that shortly. New customers, people coming to the game now, may or may not be aware of GLBA requirements. So I have to say, I do occasionally still come across someone who says either, what's GLBA? I have no idea what that is. Nobody in my institution is tracking that. And I'm like, yeah, somebody better be, because again, if you're processing financial aid, you will have signed that gateway agreement. So somebody is attesting that you are compliant. But maybe you're compliant with, again, the new safeguards, or working to be compliant with the new safeguards, but haven't started the process of understanding where you are from a NIST SP 800-171. So a recommendation, if you don't know, this would be a great opportunity to do some soul searching and be proactive, and look at actually being assessed for where you are in that process. A lot of people struggle then with the workload, the additional workload that will entail within the institution. That's a good opportunity. Here I go plugging it, but a good opportunity for you to look at maybe a virtual CISO as another hand on deck. We do a lot of the helping you develop the documentation, helping make recommendations for technologies, et cetera, and so forth. Compliance is going to be a people, a process, and a technology issue. And so if you need help on any of those fronts, we certainly jump in and do everything we can to get you to where you need to be. All right, so been talking about the changes with the framework, again, released in May of 2024. Everything changed in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to talk about that. Updates to numbering schemes. So we'll show you some example of that, but each control was actually renumbered. So even the simplest things of, if you have a system security plan, it's going to require touch labor on each specific control. We have had some controls withdrawn, but for the most part, existing controls consolidated and combined. So we're going to go through some examples of each one of those. And then we do have some new domains, some exciting things I'm excited to see implemented. But again, it's going to require at a minimum touch labor for things you've already done. And very likely for many, many people, we're going to require new processes, new boards, new things that have to be done before we acquire software, for example, to be in compliance. Okay, so withdrawn and consolidated controls. We did have some controls that were withdrawn, so they've been taken completely out. But for the most part, when something said, hey, this is a withdrawn control, it actually was consolidated into an existing control. So on the screen here, you see a couple of examples. of withdrawn controls that ended up in a larger consolidated control. And you can see there, as we go through and we try to comply with these things, the language in many cases changed quite significantly, but in a positive way that I can tell. Much more, and Bobby, feel free to jump in and tell me if you agree or disagree. But I think the language is much more thorough and it's clearer in a lot of these cases.
Yeah,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. And what we're used to seeing, and if you're familiar with the revision 2 of 171, 800-171, then you know that the language was very generic. You know, for example, maybe on the next slide, or maybe a different example, but separation of duties, it just lays it out there and everybody kind of knows what that means. But in revision 3, it actually outlines what those things mean and what they should be. We're used to looking into the description and the discussion and interpreting what we think that means for ourselves. But in revision 3, they kind of interpret that for you and kind of tell you what that may mean. So the language is a little bit more clear. It's more directive, I think, in nature in some cases. It clarifies what they want you to do to be compliant with the control when you're implementing it. So
Agree
I'll throw it out
completely.
there.
Agree completely. And another nice thing, if you're not familiar, the 171 framework actually has a supplemental document that goes alongside of it that is essentially a guide for assessors. So you can actually get that document as well. And for each one of these controls, you can say, okay, how would an assessor test me on this? What is the interview they might conduct? What is the actual technical test they might conduct? What artifacts would they be looking for from a documentation perspective? They actually lay all those things out for you for each one of those. So it's I think a brilliant idea as well, to say, okay, well, not only do I need to have this policy and this procedure in place, for example, but how would they check my work to make sure I'm actually doing this thing? Bobby and I have talked at length about this, and I completely agree. I think they're moving much more towards that directive approach of this is what you will do. And I anticipate that there will be some level. We've yet to see, for hire at how, if there will be an assessment process, what that would look like. Is it going to be a self-assessment long term, or is there going to be a third party requirement? Don't know for sure yet. Lots of rumors in the air. But if we wanted to do a thorough self-assessment, even, what would that look like? So again, most withdrawn controls were actually just consolidated into existing controls. I believe this is what Bobby was actually kind of inferring in regards to separation of duty. Just a little bit of an eye chart here, but you can see the screenshot. At a minimum, this is a good example of 3.1.4 turned into 03.01.04. Bobby and I worked in the government sector for a very long time, and somebody got paid a lot of money to make that update. So at a minimum, like I said at the beginning, you're going to have some touch labor just to even update your documentation associated with that. But if you see there, kind of on the left from revision 2, that kind of lays out what does separation of duty means. Revision 3 gets into more detail about the clarity of what's expected from the organization. And again, your assessment guide for that is helpful for understanding how that would be tested. And this is, to me, one of the more exciting pieces of all of this, the new domains. So planning, systems and services acquisition, and supply chain risk management. So I've talked a little bit in depth about the system security plan. You're going to have two major artifacts that go along with the 171 framework. Obviously, you're going to have lots of policies and procedures that fall underneath these, but the two main artifacts that you come out of specific to this particular framework are going to be your system security plan and your plan of action and milestones. So the SSP is a living document that shows where you are in compliance with the control set that we're discussing here. So, for example, and they haven't put it out for revision 3, but they did revision 2. So I'm sure it's coming along at some point in time. They actually have a SSP template that has each one of these controls laid out, and you are either compliant or non-compliant, or it doesn't apply. So it is an exercise in going through each one and saying, am I compliant or non-compliant? If I'm not compliant, how do I get compliant? What does that look like? If I am compliant, what am I actually doing to be compliant? And things that are not compliant go under your plan of action and milestones. So that is your document then that is used to track, where are we at? How are we going to get there? Obviously, there are things that are maybe a bridge too far. Maybe it's a financial reason, a political reason, but those things still have to be tracked. They can't be swept under the rug, and we have to be able to justify those things. So this is really codifying something that was already there. The SSP was already a definite. It's been a document for decades within the federal government kind of frameworks, but this actually is really putting it into the framework itself as a requirement, as an endpoint document. System and services acquisition. Anybody who works with me knows this is one that is extremely near and dear to my heart. And this is going to end up being a new set of controls associated with internal development, making sure we're following proper practices and procedures for internal development. That ends up being your, secure software development life cycles. Higher ed does some level. It depends on kind of where you are from a kind of maybe research and development institution perspective. You might see more of that in-house internal software development. But how do we engineer security into the things that we are building? So that ends up kind of being security engineering principles. Unsupported system components. I know none of us have ever had situations where we have legacy hardware or software that we're still having to support, even when the vendor isn't doing that anymore. So if we have a situation where something is not supported by the vendor, what are the practices that we need to put into place to minimize the risk to ourselves? So that is actually, again, codified in this document. And then external system services, that is going to end up being your responsibility. So if we've offloaded maybe our learning management systems or our student information systems or our quite frankly, your Office 365 or, so on and so forth. We're trying to remove the risk from us, and we're moving that in the cloud or to an external provider. How are we dictating to that external provider what security requirements that they're going to follow? And how do we hold them accountable? So what that ends up being a lot of your vendor risk management and active monitoring of your critical vendors. So that's a huge one for me. You see, beating up on CrowdStrike since it's the most recent one, but there are 1,000 examples of risks to our internal systems that are third and sometimes even fourth parties that end up causing data breaches, end up causing outages. Maybe outside of a small group of people within the IT staff, they didn't even, the institution didn't even know that they had that on their, network, or that somebody that they were using as a cloud provider used this, fourth party that now has brought us risk. So digging down into that, understanding how we grade those people and how we monitor to make sure that we are in fact holding them accountable.
Don, with the proliferation of like SaaS applications and technology across functional areas all across campus, how do we recommend that the folks from those functional areas who are identifying, procuring those technologies work with their IT teams to make sure these things are being fulfilled?
Yeah, so that is a wonderful question. So many people in the audience would be familiar with EDUCAUSE. And one of the big tools that we're seeing used across higher education, because it is designed by higher ed for higher ed for this purpose, is the HECVAT, Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Tool. Basically a questionnaire that ends up being filled out by the vendor, and tries to get out a lot of these questions. So we like to use the HECVAT before a vendor is brought into our ecosystem, to understand it's a questionnaire. Listen, it's hard to validate some of these things sometimes, right? But it's a questionnaire that gets after a lot of the internal practices and their own processes and procedures. So we like to use that. EDUCAUSE actually on their HECVAT website has a good set of forms. They've got a full one, they've got a light one, they've got a intake form, kind of a triage. I think they call it triage form. That might be your first thing that goes out to determine kind of what level of, what kind of data are we going to be collecting with this system. We might not need to do the full thing. Maybe we can do a little bit of a lighter one. So we like to use that in conjunction with some more automated tools. We use BitSight in a lot of cases to get, at least a bit of a perspective from the outside. It's not perfect. It's not going to, it's not piercing their code to be able to, we're not doing code review through BitSight. But what it does tell me is, and I fully believe this, if a company has poor security practices that I can see from an external passive, scanning approach, then I am immediately distrustful of what they say on their HECVAT. Right, wrong, or indifferent. That is just what I believe. So combination of those things, again, if they're processing that CUI or processing student PII, really sensitive stuff, we might get them on the phone. We might actually talk to their security engineers. I want to really dive down deeply into what they have. Obviously, you got artifacts like a SOC 2, maybe, or sometimes they'll even let you have access to their penetration tests. These are all good things to review if you can get access to them. We have a definite levels of participation, of willingness to share some of these things. So at a minimum, we try to look for that HECVAT in a BitSight score.
We had a follow-up question come in that you kind of got into a little bit there towards the end of the answer, but vendors will typically share compliance information, but what's the measure of whether or not they're sufficiently compliant? And so I guess you're talking about some of that follow-up digging that we do.
That's a wonderful question. And if I had the answer to what is the score on BitSight have to be, for example, for me to not lose sleep at night about their security practices, I would love to give it to you. That's going to be very institution dependent. So go ahead.
I was going to say, I can throw a little bit of a perspective in there. Understand that supply chain risk management is fairly new to vendors, just like it's new to security folks and new to customers. They don't know quite how to deal with it yet. They're not used to people saying, okay, you've had our data for years, you're managing it, you're storing it. Now we want to see how you're securing it. How are you securing your own data? How do you secure your own infrastructure? If we can't trust that you're securing your own infrastructure, then how can we trust whether you're taking care of our data? And that's a new process for them. So as Don mentioned, there's several ways. They've had a SOC 2 assessment. That's a third-party assessment that you could probably trust and use that as a level of trust to say, okay, this is how they looked on their SOC 2. So we're gonna trust that SOC 2, so we trust them. The level of cooperation would tell me if I could trust them. If they're willing to hand me over their security documentation, their network diagrams, their penetration test or risk assessment results, so I can see what their vulnerabilities are and how they've mitigated them, which is more important, then I could probably trust them at some point. Another way to trust them or not is if you have a standard that you need to uphold, like in this case, NIST Special Publication 800-171, you could hold them to that standard and say, since we have to meet this standard and you have our data, you have to meet this standard. And then you'd start that dialogue back and forth with them about, okay, we need to see your system security plan. Now, all that's pretty in depth. Ultimately, though, it really depends on how well you trust them. It's really going to come down to trust. If you like what you hear from them, whether it's through documentation or discussions with them or through external things like a SOC 2 or a BIT site, then you can trust them to the level that you feel comfortable with. There's no measure that's out there that says you can trust them or not trust them. That's going to be entirely subjective, up to you. So,
Yep, that's absolutely right. We have definitely some folks we work with that have put all of that into policy. So when we're working to procure new software, hardware, services, we have set some. I mean, I'm going to be extremely candid, arbitrary, standards. Because like I said, if I had the answer to, if you make over a 700 bit site, you're never going to get breached. That's just not the case. But we do have some, hey, this is where we start to have concerns. Maybe it's less a number, and it's more of a, well, you look good, except for you have, you're running, public facing remote desktop protocol and critical servers, stuff like that. But just putting it down in writing. What goes along with that, though, in those cases, not only is there a policy, we're always going to have exceptions, whether that ends up being a, legacy system that we, cannot get rid of for, economic reasons, or it's a piece of software that goes along with a critical, research system, and it's, being held together with, baling wire and duct tape, which happens often. We need to have, a process where, obviously it's still reviewed to the best of our ability, and whoever, up the food chain from a leadership perspective needs to sign off and accept the risk. So if something happens, it wasn't an IT, screwed this up and I can't believe, oh my gosh. It's like, no, we looked at it and we knew there was a risk, and here's why we chose to go that way. And, hopefully the risk is never realized. So, yeah, all that stuff, kind of in that system and services acquisition, we're, a lot of energy going into that right now, for sure.
We had just a real quick, what's the name of the scanning tool Dawn was referencing? That's BitSite, and we also make that available as sort of a service package too, that we do as a shared service for multiple institutions, right, Dawn?
Yep, we do. Again, it's taking a purely external perspective. You might have heard of security scorecard as kind of the same thing. I don't like it as well. That's just my personal opinion. But same kind of idea, basically taking an external look at the assets associated with a company, and giving you an idea, again, of their patching hygiene. Have they been involved in compromises? Again, it might end up just being their public facing website that we're able to see, which doesn't do you a lot of good if you're trying to understand if they engineered their software well, except for, again, I stand by it. If they can't keep the public facing stuff looking good, then I have concerns about everything else. One last thing, Bobby made a great point. I 100% believe that the partnership that you get from a vendor, their willingness to work with you, to supply you documents, even if, we don't need to necessarily even have copies of things. If you want to get on a Zoom call and we can go over it together because you don't want it to leave your infrastructure, that's fine too. But the willingness to work and help us understand the security practices is a definite, a big, green flag for me with a company. I've seen everything from companies that scored poorly. We get on a call with them like, hey, we see you have a previous breach. Let's talk through what has changed. Or we see you have poor scoring in these areas. Their willingness to say, that's not acceptable. We want to fix that. I've had companies that wanted to have, monthly weekly, monthly updates with me to show how they're improving along the way. And this is just in the procurement process. We haven't even, signed any contracts yet. And then the other end of the spectrum are the ones that are like, I've never heard of the HECVAT. I have no idea who you are, buzz off. And that does happen also. So to Bobby's point, this is kind of growing pains for all of us. But it's really important as we're starting to move to a much more SaaS heavy environment.
Two more quick things on this, and then we'll get back on track.
Okay.
But we had a few comments come in. One around we're seeing vendors more and more these days requiring an NDA for HECVATs. So we're also asking for SOC 2 reports as well. That's from Ron Loneker over at St. Elizabeth, who I think, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, you're working with the EDUCAUSE working group on NIST right now. So that's great stuff. If you can, that was to hosts and panelists, Ron, if you can put that in the main public chat so everybody can see that comment, we'd appreciate that. And then a question around, can you speak about handling a situation where a vendor shows as risky to what you can see, but the school is pushing for it as an as needed product, that it's something key, but they're showing up risky? What do we do?
Absolutely, happens all the time. So that is where kind of again, we hopefully have proactively put a policy into place about what are the requirements, even if they are arbitrary. What are the requirements that we want these software, hardware, services to meet? And then that is a risk exception memo, something that is signed by, whether it's again, dean, somebody at that level, somebody above the requester's level. Their leadership needs to be involved in understanding, hey, we're making this choice. It's risky. Here's why it's risky. Here are the things. I like to always have a section in there that talks about kind of what are the mitigating factors that we're putting into place to try to mitigate that risk down. It's never going to be zero, but we're going to try to get as low as possible. But we still know there's a risk there. We accept it. Here's who's signing off on that. And I'll be honest with you, that's a controversial thing to try to put into an organization. But now you have this framework that is mandating these processes. So that's how I've done it in the past. And again, it does, when you bring to a board level a document that says, well, this software is really, really sketchy, but we have to have it, they don't necessarily want to accept that risk. So maybe we make maybe it's not as much of a requirement as we thought it was. Maybe we can look at some alternatives. So that's just what I've had some success with in the past.
Yeah, if I could touch on that as well. And I'd actually answered some of that question in the chat a couple of minutes before the question came up. But if you have the application that you rely on, you must use it for whatever reason, because there's not enough vendors out there that provide that service, or it's a service that's widely used within the education community, and everyone else has had success with it and you have to use it. A couple of things there is that if the vendor does not want to work with you on their security and letting you know how secure they are and helping you out with that, then obviously that's a red flag. But you also need to do, like Don said, a risk assessment of, do we really need this software or not? Can we live without it? Are there alternatives? And ultimately, it may not be your decision as technology folks. It may be higher up in the food chain kind of decision. But your job is to present the risks of that. And if in the end you wind up having to make that choice, again, as Don said, you have to accept that risk. Somebody does, and go with that. But then you can turn right around and say, okay, we have to accept this risk. We have to use this vendor, and they're not willing to share their security information with us, so we don't really know how secure they are. Then you take the opportunity whenever you can, it may be when you renegotiate the contract, to impose security requirements on them at that point and say, okay, if you need remote access, you got to use MFA. We require that you demonstrate that you're encrypting all data. We require that you vet your folks and give us that information for anyone who has access to our data. Start imposing those requirements on them, and you may get pushback. You probably will, but that's one alternative if you can't get them to work with you.
Mhm. Absolutely the case. In fact, that goes right into that last kind of column there, the supply chain risk management. Supply chain risk management has been a big deal in the federal government for a long time. This is just basically opening again this up, the azimuth for this up to a wider group. Bobby can tell you in previous lives that we've worked on, in situations where down to the component level of things going into a system that you had to know where it came from, making sure that they even had a process for a while they were going to try called trusted foundries, where we know exactly at the component level where things are manufactured, and then we trust those places that they were manufactured. We're never going to get to that level in higher ed, but what we do need to take away from this, again, you get to that acquisition strategies, tools, and methods. So back to that kind of that same point of a very methodical approach. Listen, we work with a lot of folks that we get involved in the process sometimes after somebody's already bought something. And then they're like, oh, yeah, I guess we needed to have a security review of that, huh? And then it's coming in sometimes through a help desk ticket, or sometimes it's coming in through an email. Somehow we're getting our arms around that, streamlining that process, helping people understand that we're not doing this just to be fuddy-dudds, but we actually, it's going to be good. Maybe we can build some efficiencies into the process as well to make it quicker from a implementation perspective, but more secure. So win-win for everybody involved. Bobby, anything further on supply chain risk management? I'm guessing we're not going to be able to tell everybody that they have to go start asking third parties where their chips were manufactured.
No, I mean, there's a lot of issues and questions that come up with that, and it's not a question you can answer. You can't answer all the questions in 1 hour. It's just one of those things we have to work with, and obviously that's one of the things we do work with folks on, is trying to get that supply chain risk management process up and running. Now, if you look at the controls there, you've got to have a plan. You've got to develop a plan, and that plan needs to cover what strategies you're going to use to try to maintain a solid supply chain risk management program, what requirements you're going to impose, and how you're going to do that. So all those three controls can be answered if you develop a comprehensive plan for it and,
Yep.
and actually implement that plan.
Absolutely. It's so much of it is about that documenting what we're going to do, and then being able to show in the future that we're following it. So I think that's actually what we're getting into, right? No, not yet. So some new controls have been added. An example there, system component inventory, having a good inventory of everything that constitutes. By the way, just a note here, and if you're not necessarily like us and read NIST documents for fun in the evenings, the term system has thrown people off for me in the past. Like, what do you mean system? This is, I have a whole network. System is a very broad term in kind of government lingo, government compliance lingo. So don't let, it's not like a single information system. It's a system of systems, if that makes any sense at all. So that has thrown people off in the past. The big point here that we wanted to make about the substantive changes that have gone on is a much increased focus on not only saying that you do things, but having the ability to prove that you do. And so that's where I would go back again and use that supplementary document that talks about how will this be assessed, and make sure that if you're able to do those things, whether it be a interview process, a documentation review, or an actual technical analysis showing that you're doing those things. any auditor that comes in, if you're able to do that, is going to, if you follow that assessment guideline, you're going to be in good shape. That's it. Bobby, anything further from you that I may have glazed over?
I want to bring up something from the last slide that you mentioned, if you can go back to that for a second. Like I said, as a previous government auditor, and even when I say that phrase, I get a bad taste in my mouth. I need to drink mouthwash after I say that government auditor phrase. But I can tell you that what the mentality is, and for so long in probably a lot of these compliance vehicles and in the compliance world, people thought, well, if I get the documentation, if I make a policy, I'm good. And that really has never been the case. And it is even more, there's more of an emphasis on this now. It's not enough to prove that it's not enough to say that you do it. It's not enough to tell the auditor when you're in the conference room, yep, we do that. They are going to ask that, and they're going to say, well, let's see the documentation. Documentation shows that you have a process, but anybody can create documentation in a few days. Okay. What the auditors want to see is for you to prove that you're actually doing it. Like if we go over the auditing controls and I ask you, are you auditing? Are you saving logs? Who has access to those logs? And you answer those questions in the document, then I'm going to say, okay, let's get up and go to a system and you show me that, prove it to me. So there's going to be more of an emphasis on these things. You're going to have to provide artifacts like log samples that would show that. Or in some cases, if an auditor is on site, you're going to have to show that you do those things. So I think that's one mentality shift that needs to change. It's not a matter, this is not a documentation exercise. Do you have to have that? Absolutely. I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a second. Security and compliance and risk are three totally different things. They are not the same thing. They are related. You can be secure, and I think most of you are from what I've seen, but you can also be compliant, and we may need some improvement there. And then really mature organizations manage risk also. I think a lot of organizations, especially most of the customers I have and folks that I've seen out in higher education, are doing the things to make themselves secure. They're keeping the bad folks out. They're keeping their organizations off the news, which is the first and foremost thing that we want. But then when you get into the compliance thing, and I say, hey, you got to develop documentation for this. And I agree that documentation doesn't keep the bad people out, and it does not keep you off the news. That's all the technical stuff that you're probably already doing. But what documentation does do is make you compliant with whatever standards you have to be, in this case, NIST. And it also shows due diligence and due care. It proves legally that you are doing the right things in terms of documenting what you do, in terms of having a process that's standardized and repeatable and so on. So the documentation does serve its purpose, and it's the least fun of anything we do in security. I get that. But you're still going to have to do it for this exercise. So I thought I'd just point that out, that it is more than a documentation exercise. It's not just a
Absolutely.
matter of, you got to actually do it.
Yep. I'm just, as Bobby was talking, I pulled up the assessment kind of protocols, the assessing security requirements for 171, just for a random control. So this particular one is 31201 security assessments. So we say that we've done a security assessment, whether that's a penetration test or something along those lines. How do they intend to validate that you actually did a security assessment? Well, step one, review the actual security assessment. Review your policy on doing them, the procedures that you have to plan for them, and then the actual report, and then interview personnel who were involved. So it, again, to Bobby's point, it is that next level on of, okay, as it always should have been, absolutely. Of not only let's check your documentation to see what you say you do, we're actually going to test and see that you have done those things.
Don, we had somebody just ask if you can share that last that last material you were reading from, either as a screen share or in the chat.
Let me actually, because I have it on a different system sitting in front of me. So let me.
We could send it in follow up as well if it's
Yeah,
something.
yeah. That might be the best. Let's do that.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'm gonna drop out of Zoom and probably break something.
Okay.
But no, I think that's a great thing for you to do as you're going through this process. Is if you have that auditor's mindset, whether you need mouthwash afterwards or not. But if you have that auditor's mindset of what I need to do to prove that we're doing these things, then you won't go wrong.
Cool. So we have a couple more questions that have come in. One, and this seems like it was asked at a specific point in time that we might have missed, and let me know if we need more information on what they're asking for. Where can the supplemental documentation be found?
Yep, that's the document I was just referring to.
Okay.
I think I can probably drop that in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing because I don't think you need that anymore. And I will pull that up right now.
Cool. So keep an eye on the chat. We'll try and link that through, and we'll send it in follow up as well. Another question here. FSA said the following in February 2023. The department will issue guidance on NIST 800-171 compliance in a future electronic announcement, but again encourages institutions to begin incorporating the information security controls required into the written information security program required under GLBA as soon as possible. Has a formal date for implementation been communicated yet?
Not yet, not that I've seen. And Ron and I actually had a discussion about this yesterday. And Ron has been a great resource on this from an EDUCAUSE kind of GLBA perspective. But to my knowledge, no, we have not. We certainly have. So one of the forcing functions they've used in the past, and again, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the forcing functions they've used in the past has been that SAIG document, the gateway that has to be attested every year. So what happened in some cases is that we had to attest that we were in compliance, and then here comes the audit almost straight away. So not a lot of time between those two time periods. So we're hoping that that's not what happens again, that we get a little bit more of a heads up, but I haven't heard a finalized date yet. No.
Okay. And then one more question here, and we have a few more minutes, so feel free if you have any additional questions, use the chat, use the Q&A. And there's the link in the chat to that supporting documentation. So regarding supply chain compliance, are we saying that we should create a policy, for example, for purchasing flash drives, that we don't buy cheap flash drives from some unknown vendor that cost $1, and that we should use a vendor that we know to be trustworthy?
I think that's absolutely a great example of what you would want to do. Yes. I've talked more about maybe, again, assessing software vendors. But absolutely, like any procurement that we have that's going to affect in any way the network or the systems or data, absolutely, we need to think through the requirements for that to be approved to go on the network, and put that in writing.
Cool. So I think a good one to end on at this point with about 3 minutes left would be, and especially because we had lots of folks, lots of non-technical folks join us for today's call. What can folks in those kind of non-technical roles and functional areas across the institution that are managing or using applications that are managing students' data, financial information, things like that, how can they work effectively with the technology departments to kind of stay on track for all this stuff? And I think vice versa too. How can IT departments get closer and work more effectively with those functional areas as they're considering software, as they're buying software, and kind of get ahead of the curve on some of this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I would love to see, kind of administrators, leadership, people, people working in, with the sensitive data. So your financial aid, your personnel, Number one, you're going to have a lot more, especially when this goes into effect, we're going to have a lot more requirement for things like that vetting process. So supporting us, we're not trying to be the bad guy. We're not trying to be difficult, but understanding that we're doing this, A, because we have to, and it's a requirement now, but B, we're also doing it. Nobody wants to be the next university that's on the news because they had a major data breach. So understanding why we're doing the things we do, supporting us, helping us streamline the processes. And as IT people, and listen, I've worked in cybersecurity before it was called cybersecurity. Back in the day, it was information assurance for a very long time. And we've always had a reputation of being, Mr. and Mrs. No. We have to be, as IT professionals, as security professionals, we have to find that balance between being a security professional and enabling business objectives. At the end of the day, higher education, has business objectives just like everybody else does. How do we find that balance? So having that mindset of let's work together, let's understand what the leadership, what are the goals, what are the strategies, hopefully you have them, and how can we support those? It really, the difference between organizations that the CIO, maybe the CISO, the president, the CFO all come together, we're doing tabletop exercises, we're doing those at least annual briefings on here's the risk, here's what our risk register looks like, here's what's going on behind the scenes, having some quality metrics, and having that partnership is just so much better for everybody involved. So yeah, somehow we've got to come together, find that partnership, and find that balance.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time today, Dawn. Thanks, Bobby, for your time and participation as well. I want to let everybody know before we break, we did touch on it a little bit, but I didn't want to make too much of a pitch during the content. Edge and in partnership with Dawn and the team of vCISOs that we work with here, we do offer that the BitSite third-party scanning service at a reduced rate that really fits better for higher education institutions, and along with that, some of that work with our CISOs on kind of interpreting what we see and figuring out next steps of how to sort of manage and make the most of that information that we get from that program. So I'd encourage you, if you are considering, just sort of getting into or expanding your third-party assessment and management of vendors on the security side, the team here does a great job of that and does it, really, really affordably because of that nonprofit perspective that we bring to the table. So if that's of interest, I think lots of you probably know the names Michelle Ferraro and Aaron Brink, two of Edge's member service managers, and they can really sort of help you work through your needs and your challenges and connect the dots to Dawn and her team where appropriate. So I'd encourage you to reach out to the Edge team. Anybody on the Edge team, but Michelle and Aaron are great resources to help connect the dots and get our institutions everything that they need. So we really appreciate you spending the time, and thanks for the comment coming in. Thanks for making technical more personal and less techy, a little more consumable. So we appreciate the work that you do, Dawn, Bobby. Thanks for bringing this stuff to light at a really relatable human level. I think it's really important, especially as these requirements become formalized and really start to affect things like financial aid. This stuff is key. So we really appreciate the insights and the time. Thanks everybody for spending a bit of your morning with us.
Thanks.